The arrogant king humiliates a servant, not realizing she is his love from the past. The morning fog hung heavy over High Crest Harbor as the battered merchant vessel limped toward the docks. From the royal castle perched high on the cliffs, the ship looked like a wounded animal crawling home to die. Guards squinted through the mist, their hands tensing on crossbows as they assessed the damage. Splintered railings, torn sails, and scorch marks along the starboard side told the story of a pirate attack that the ship had somehow survived. Among the disheveled survivors who stumbled onto the weathered planks of the harbor stood a woman unlike the others. Where they wept with relief or called out for loved ones, she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the imposing castle above. Gray streaked her once-auburn hair, and a jagged scar ran from her right temple to the corner of her mouth, twisting her features into a permanent half-grimace. Her posture, though slightly bent from years of hard labor, maintained a dignity that caught the eye of the harbor master. "Your name, woman?" he demanded, quill poised over a ledger. "Josephine," she answered, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. Just Josephine. 20 years earlier, that same harbor had witnessed another departure. Hasty, secretive, and doomed, Prince Jefferson Montgomery had stood in the shadows, clutching a small leather pouch containing 2 halves of a royal medallion, one for himself and one for Hope, the merchant's daughter who had captured his heart. They planned to flee that night, the prince willing to forsake his crown for love. "I'll be waiting exactly at midnight," he had whispered against her lips. 2 hours from now, we'll be free." Hope never arrived. Instead, the prince received a crumpled note claiming she had chosen another man, a lie that would transform him into the cold-hearted ruler who now sat on Highcrest's throne. King Jefferson's council chamber fell silent as he slammed his fist on the ancient oak table. "Pirates dare to raid my waters again," he growled, his crown sitting heavily on his brow. At 45, the king's handsome features had hardened. Lines of bitterness etched around his mouth, his eyes flinty beneath heavy brows. "Double the coastal patrols. Any pirate ship spotted is to be sunk without question." "Your Majesty," ventured Duke Cornelius, stroking his silver-streaked beard, "perhaps we should first determine which kingdom these pirates serve. They could be mercenaries hired by—" "I don't care if they serve the devil himself," Jefferson cut him off. "The message will be the same. Attack Highcrest, and you die." He turned toward the window, effectively dismissing his advisors. Only when the chamber emptied did the king allow his shoulders to slump. From his pocket, he withdrew half of a gold medallion, running his thumb over the royal crest. 20 years hadn't dulled the pain, only transformed it into something harder, colder, a weapon he wielded against his own heart. Down in the castle kitchens, Josephine scrubbed pots with raw hands, her eyes missing nothing. She had secured a position through Mistress Gertrude, the head cook who desperately needed extra hands. "The merchants bring fewer girls from the countryside these days," Gertrude had complained, something about the king's temper scaring them off. She eyed Josephine's scarred face without pity. "You'll do. No one looks too hard at kitchen maids anyway." That suited Josephine perfectly. As she worked, she catalogued faces, noting which servants had been here 20 years ago, which might remember a merchant's daughter named Hope. Most wouldn't recognize her now, the soft curves of youth replaced by angles, her once smooth skin weathered by sun and salt, her eyes hollow from witnessing too much suffering. "The king likes to inspect the kitchens himself sometimes," whispered Anna, a young maid with quick hands and quicker gossip. "Terrifies everyone half to death. They say he once had a cook flogged for using the wrong spices." Josephine merely nodded, though her heart quickened. She had seen Jefferson from afar during the survivor processing, taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader, his face a mask of control as he surveyed the damaged ship from horseback. He hadn't glanced twice at the huddled survivors. That night, alone on her thin pallet in the servants' quarters, Josephine unwrapped a small bundle concealed in her meager belongings. Inside lay a curved dagger with an ornate handle and a small, corked vial of dark liquid, gifts from the Eastern doctor who had saved her life and taught her the healing arts. Beside them rested half of a gold medallion, its edge jagged where it had been broken. "I returned for truth, not vengeance," she whispered to herself, though the line between the two had blurred over the years. Find the boy first, then decide. The following day, as Josephine chopped vegetables for the evening meal. The kitchen fell abruptly silent. She looked up to see King Jefferson himself striding between the preparation tables, inspecting the dishes being prepared for that night's feast. His personal guard followed 2 steps behind, a young captain whose bearing suggested both discipline and intelligence. Josephine froze, knife suspended mid-cut. The captain couldn't be more than 19 or 20. His eyes, a striking emerald green that mirrored Jefferson's, scanned the kitchen with practiced efficiency, but it was his smile, briefly flashed at a kitchen maid who nearly dropped a platter, that sent a jolt through Josephine's body. Her smile, the smile she'd given Jefferson in their secret garden so many years ago. Her son, it had to be. "What's this?" The king's voice snapped her back to awareness. He stood directly before her, gesturing at the herbs she'd been adding to the stew. "Eastern spices, Your Majesty," she answered, lowering her gaze. "For flavor and certain medicinal benefits." "Medicinal?" His eyebrow arched skeptically. "They ease digestion and calm the mind," she explained, careful to maintain the accent she'd cultivated during her years abroad. "I learned their properties while serving a physician in the East." Jefferson leaned closer. Inhaling the aroma, something flickered in his eyes. A memory, perhaps, of spiced tea shared with a merchant's daughter in a hidden garden. For a moment, the hard lines of his face softened. "Carry on," he said abruptly, turning away as he departed. The young captain lingered, his gaze catching on Josephine's scarred face with unexpected kindness. "The herbs smell wonderful," he offered quietly. "The king rarely comments on food. You've impressed him." Josephine couldn't speak, her throat tightening as she looked into her son's eyes. He misinterpreted her silence as fear. "Don't worry," he added with that heartbreakingly familiar smile. "His bark is worse than his bite, usually." Then he was gone, following his king, his father, leaving Josephine clutching the edge of the table to remain upright. She had found them both in a single day, the man who had once promised to forsake a kingdom for her love, and the son who had been torn from her arms at birth. Now, she just needed to uncover the truth about why. A week passed as Josephine established her routine in the castle kitchens. She learned the rhythms of palace life, when the king took his meals, which corridors remained empty during council meetings, and how the young Captain Levi conducted his daily training sessions in the courtyard. Each scrap of information she carefully stored away, pieces of a puzzle she was slowly assembling. "You've got a talent with those herbs," Mistress Gertrude remarked one afternoon as Josephine prepared a special blend of spices. "The king has requested your seasoning twice now." Josephine nodded, focusing on grinding dried leaves with a mortar and pestle. "Simple knowledge from my time in the East." "Well, you're to prepare the king's personal dishes for tonight's feast," the head cook declared. "It's the anniversary of his coronation. 20 years on the throne. 20 years. The exact time since hope had disappeared and Jefferson had hardened his heart. The significance wasn't lost on Josephine. That evening, the great hall gleamed with candles and polished silver. Nobles from across Highcrest gathered in their finery, raising crystal chalices in toast after toast to their stern king. From her position serving food, Josephine observed Jefferson seated at the high table, his crown catching the light. Despite being surrounded by courtiers, he appeared utterly alone. Duke Cornelius leaned close to the king, whispering something that made Jefferson frown. The duke had aged well, his silver hair and trimmed beard lending him an air of distinction that masked the calculated ambition in his eyes. Beside him sat his wife, the Duchess Elaine, whose practiced smile never reached her eyes as she surveyed the gathering. Captain Levi stood at attention behind the king's chair, his gaze constantly scanning the crowd. When a serving girl spilled wine nearby, Josephine noticed how the young captain quietly helped her clean it before anyone could make a scene, a small kindness that his supposed uncle, the Duke, observed with narrowed eyes. As the feast progressed, Jefferson grew increasingly restless, his knuckles white around his goblet. When most of the nobles were deep in their cups, he abruptly stood. "Continue without me," he commanded before striding from the hall. Levi following at a respectful distance, Josephine, helping clear plates from the high table, found herself alone near the king's abandoned place setting. Before her sat a crystal chalice unlike the others, older, with delicate engravings that marked it as a royal heirloom. Acting on instinct, she reached for it. "Mind yourself with that," hissed an older servant. "That was the Queen Mother's ceremonial chalice. The king insists on using it for official functions." The Queen Mother, the woman who had conspired with Duke Cornelius to separate her from Jefferson. Josephine's fingers trembled slightly as they closed around the stem. The weight of 2 decades of suffering seemed concentrated in this delicate piece of crystal. She never intended to drop it. Perhaps it was fate, or the tremble in her hand, or simply the slick condensation on the glass. But as she lifted it, the chalice slipped from her grasp and shattered against the stone floor with a sound like breaking ice. The hall fell silent. What happened? King Jefferson's voice cut through the hush as he re-entered, drawn by the commotion. His eyes fell on the shards of crystal, then rose to Josephine's face. Recognition flickered, not of hope, but of the scarred kitchen woman who prepared his spices. The Queen Mother's chalice, someone whispered. Jefferson's face transformed, rage replacing the momentary recognition. "Who is responsible for this?" he demanded, though his eyes never left Josephine. "I am, Your Majesty," she answered quietly, meeting his gaze. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. "Do you have any idea what you've destroyed? That chalice has been in the royal family for generations. It appears to be broken, much like other things of value you failed to protect," Josephine replied, the words escaping before she could reconsider. The hall gasped collectively. Duke Cornelius's eyebrows shot up in undisguised interest. Jefferson's face drained of color. "What did you say?" he whispered, voice dangerously soft. Josephine dropped her gaze. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I spoke without thinking." "Indeed you did." His voice hardened. "Guards, take this woman to the dungeons, since she's so outspoken. Perhaps she'll enjoy conversing with the rats." As 2 guards seized her arms, Josephine looked up once more. "Your Majesty judges with the same haste with which he lost what he most loved," she murmured, loud enough for only him to hear. Jefferson recoiled as if struck. Something flickered in his eyes, confusion, recognition, pain, before the mask slammed back into place. "Take her away," he commanded, his voice betraying the slightest tremor, as the guards dragged her from the hall. Josephine caught the troubled gaze of Captain Levi, who stepped forward slightly before catching himself. She also noted how Duke Cornelius watched the entire scene with calculating eyes, filing away every reaction, every nuance. The dungeons of Highcrest Castle were as cold and damp as Josephine had expected. The guards tossed her into a small cell with little ceremony, the iron door clanging shut behind her. "You'll be assigned duties in the morning," one guard informed her gruffly. "Until then, consider your tongue, and how it might serve you better in the future." Left alone in darkness broken only by distant torchlight, Josephine sat on the damp straw, considering her next move. The confrontation had been unplanned, but perhaps it would serve her purpose. From the dungeons, she could access areas of the castle normally forbidden to kitchen staff. "Hope wouldn't recognize you now," she whispered to herself, running fingers over the scar on her cheek. But then, Jefferson has changed too. Morning brought a sour-faced guard who escorted her to the castle's archives. Ancient rooms filled with dusty scrolls and records stretching back generations. "You're to assist the archivist in organizing these documents," he explained. "Apparently, His Majesty feels your sharp tongue suggests you can read. Unusual for kitchen staff." The elderly archivist barely glanced up from his scrolls as she entered. "Dust those shelves first," he instructed, pointing to a far corner with a gnarled finger. "Then sort those records by date." Josephine set to work, her mind racing. The archives might contain information about what truly happened 20 years ago, perhaps even records of a royal child born in secret. Hours later, as the archivist dozed at his desk, she discovered a narrow door partially hidden behind a tapestry. It opened onto a spiraling staircase leading deeper into the dungeon complex. Heart pounding, Josephine descended the worn steps. The passage ended at another heavy door, this one guarded by a single, dozing soldier. Years of survival had taught her stealth. She moved past him like a shadow. Beyond lay a row of cells different from the common dungeon. These were for prisoners of importance. Most stood empty, save for the last. There, hunched on a bench, sat an elderly man with a tangled white beard and chains on his wrists. He looked up as she approached, rheumy eyes narrowing. "Come to gawk at the fallen advisor," he asked, voice cracked from disuse. Sir Thomas, Josephine whispered, recognizing the king's former counselor, the man rumored to have helped Hope escape. The old man stiffened. Who asks? Josephine glanced back to ensure they were alone, then leaned closer to the bars. Someone who once trusted you with her life and lost everything. Understanding dawned in the old man's eyes, followed quickly by disbelief. Impossible, he breathed. Hope. Once, she answered. Now I am Josephine, and I've returned to learn the truth. You should not have returned, Sir Thomas whispered, his gnarled fingers clutching the iron bars. The danger remains as great as it was 20 years ago. Josephine's eyes hardened. I've faced worse dangers than palace intrigue, Sir Thomas. Tell me what happened that night. The old man glanced nervously down the corridor. They said you fled with another man, a traveling merchant, the prince. Jefferson was devastated. I was taken, Josephine corrected, her voice tight with controlled fury. Drugged during our meeting and awakened days later on a ship bound for the Eastern Territories. Sir Thomas's face drained of color. I suspected as much, but had no proof. The Queen Mother presented a letter in your hand. A forgery, Josephine cut in. And my son. What of the child I bore in captivity? Before Sir Thomas could answer, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Josephine quickly stepped back from the cell. We'll speak again, she promised in a hurried whisper. She grabbed a nearby broom and was diligently sweeping when a guard rounded the corner. What are you doing here? This area is restricted, he barked. Josephine bowed her head submissively. Forgive me, sir. The archivist sent me to clean. I must have taken a wrong turn. The guard scowled, but seemed to accept her explanation. Get back to the archives. Now. For the next 3 days, Josephine's new position gave her unprecedented access to the castle's historical records. Between sorting and cleaning duties, she methodically searched for any documentation of a royal birth 20 years ago. She found nothing. No record of her pregnancy. No mention of a child born to the prince. The official records showed only that Hope, daughter of spice merchant William Fletcher, had fled the kingdom with a foreign trader, breaking the prince's heart and sending him into a spiral of bitterness that shaped his reign. On the 4th day, her routine was interrupted when the archivist announced, "You're wanted for duty in the training yard. They need someone to carry water for the guards." The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the practice field where Highcrest's elite guards trained. Josephine moved among them with a water pitcher, filling cups for parched soldiers. From this vantage point, she could observe Captain Levi as he led the younger recruits through sword drills. He moved with a fluid grace that reminded her painfully of Jefferson in his youth. But there were other gestures. The way he tilted his head when considering a problem, how he brushed hair from his forehead, that were unmistakably her own. "Water, if you please," called a voice, startling her from her thoughts. Captain Levi stood before her, hand outstretched for a cup, up close. The resemblance to both his parents was even more striking. Jefferson's commanding presence softened by Hope's compassionate eyes. "Of course, Captain," she replied, pouring carefully to avoid spilling a drop. "You're the woman from the feast," he observed, studying her scarred face without judgment. "The one who broke the Queen Mother's chalice." Josephine tensed slightly. "I am," to her surprise. A small smile played at his lips. "That was quite the declaration you made to the king." "A foolish one," she answered cautiously. "Perhaps," he agreed, taking a long drink, "though there are those who might call it brave." He lowered his voice. "His Majesty can be harsh, but he wasn't always so. You seem to know him well?" "I've served in the Royal Guard since I was 16, Levi explained. "Duke Cornelius, my uncle, arranged the position." The word uncle sent a chill through Josephine. So that was the lie they had told him. "The Duke has been most generous," Levi continued. "He raised me after my parents died when I was an infant." "Both parents?" Josephine asked carefully. "So I'm told my mother died in childbirth, my father in battle shortly after." His expression clouded. "I have no memories of either." Before Josephine could respond, an imperious voice cut through the training yard. "Captain, a moment of your time." Duke Cornelius approached, his elegant riding clothes immaculate despite the dusty yard. His gaze slid dismissively over Josephine before focusing on Levi. "Your Excellency," Levi bowed slightly. "I didn't expect you to observe training today." "A pleasant surprise, then," the Duke replied smoothly. "I was hoping to discuss the security arrangements for next week's council meeting." His eyes narrowed as he noted the way Josephine lingered. "You may go, servant." Josephine bowed and retreated, but not before catching the Duke's suspicious glance. She continued her water rounds, staying within earshot of their conversation. "You shouldn't fraternize with the help, Levi," the Duke was saying, "especially one disciplined by the king himself. I was merely being polite, uncle. Politeness has its place. But remember your station. You're not just any captain. You're my nephew and protege." The Duke's voice lowered. "One day, your position may be even more significant. You speak in riddles again, uncle. All will become clear in time. For now, focus on your duties and the king's protection." As they moved away, Josephine noticed a small group of off-duty guards talking nearby. "The resemblance is uncanny," one whispered. "If I didn't know better—" "Hush," another cut him off. "That kind of talk is dangerous. I'm just saying what everyone thinks. The timing, the coloring—" "Enough!" The senior guard glanced around nervously. "The Duke would have your tongue." Josephine moved casually closer, pretending to organize her water jugs. "What of his mother?" asked a younger guard. "The story is she was some foreign noble who died in childbirth. That's the official tale." The first guard shrugged. "Though old Lucinda in the laundry tells it differently." Josephine nearly dropped her pitcher. Lucinda, the laundress who had once been Hope's confidant, that evening, after completing her archive duties, Josephine slipped away to the castle laundry. The cavernous room was nearly empty, save for an elderly woman folding linens with practiced precision. "Excuse me," Josephine called softly. "Are you Lucinda?" The old woman looked up, her hands never pausing in their work. "Who's asking?" "My name is Josephine. I'm new to the castle staff." Lucinda's eyes narrowed as she assessed Josephine's scarred face. "You're the one who broke the queen's chalice. Bold move, that." "Not intentional." Josephine stepped closer. "I heard you've served the castle for many years." "Longer than most have been alive," Lucinda agreed with a hint of pride. "Worked here since I was a girl. Served 3 generations of royalty, including the current king when he was a prince." Something cautious flickered in Lucinda's gaze. "Indeed. What's your interest in ancient history, girl?" Josephine glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I heard you might know something about Captain Levi's parentage." The old woman's hands finally stilled. "Dangerous questions," she murmured, eyes suddenly sharp with suspicion. "Who sent you?" "No one sent me. I'm looking for clarity." Lucinda studied her for a long moment, then shook her head. "I've nothing to say about the captain that isn't common knowledge. His mother was some foreign lady who died birthing him. The Duke, being childless, took him in out of family duty. And his father, a soldier who fell in battle. So they say." Lucinda resumed her folding with renewed vigor. "Now, if you've no laundry needs, I've work to finish." As Josephine turned to leave, Lucinda suddenly reached out, catching her wrist. The old woman's grip was surprisingly strong as she pulled Josephine closer, studying her features intently. "There's something about the way you tilt your head," Lucinda whispered, her eyes widening. "Something familiar." Josephine held her breath as recognition dawned in the old woman's eyes. "It can't be," Lucinda breathed, her wrinkled hand rising involuntarily toward Josephine's scarred cheek. "Tomorrow," Josephine whispered, "the old willow by the north wall at midday." Without waiting for a response, she pulled away and hurried from the laundry, heart pounding. Behind her, Lucinda stood frozen, linens forgotten as she stared after the ghost from the past who had somehow returned to Highcrest Castle. From the shadows of an adjoining corridor, Duke Cornelius watched Josephine's hasty departure with narrowed eyes, noting the direction of her flight and the stunned expression on old Lucinda's face. Something about this scarred servant woman troubled him deeply, something he couldn't quite place. But Cornelius hadn't maintained his position through oversight. He made a mental note to have this Josephine watched more closely. Very closely indeed. The ancient willow tree stood like a sentinel at Highcrest's northern wall, its sweeping branches creating a natural sanctuary. At midday, Josephine slipped away from the archives, a bundle of herbs clutched in her hands as a pretense for gathering plants. Her heart raced as she approached the meeting place, uncertain whether Lucinda would come. "I thought I'd dreamed it," came a trembling voice from behind the trunk. The elderly laundress stepped into view, her lined face awash with disbelief. "Hope. Is it truly you beneath those scars?" Josephine glanced around to ensure they were alone, before nodding once. "Though that name belongs to another life, Lucinda." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She reached out with shaking fingers to touch Josephine's cheek, as if confirming she wasn't an apparition. "All these years, we thought you dead, the prince. He searched for months. Tell me everything," Josephine urged, guiding them deeper into the willow's shelter. "What happened after I disappeared?" "Chaos," Lucinda whispered. "Prince Jefferson was like a man possessed. He refused to believe you'd left willingly. Despite the letter, he sent search parties to every corner of the realm." Her voice dropped lower, "until the Queen Mother presented evidence you'd been seen boarding a merchant vessel with another man, a foreigner with whom you'd allegedly been conducting a secret affair." "Lies," Josephine hissed. "I was taken against my will. I suspected as much." Lucinda nodded. The girl I knew would never have abandoned the prince she loved, but the evidence seemed irrefutable. "Witnesses, the letter in your hand, and my child?" Josephine asked, her voice breaking slightly. "What of the baby I bore in captivity?" Lucinda's eyes widened. "So it's true, I always wondered. Captain Levi. My son, Jefferson's son," Josephine confirmed. "Torn from my arms at birth and apparently delivered to the Duke. The timing always seemed suspicious," Lucinda admitted. "The Duke returned from a diplomatic mission with an infant nephew just months after you vanished. But none dared question it, not with the Queen Mother's support and the prince's heart shattered. And Sir Thomas, why was he imprisoned? He continued investigating your disappearance even after the official search ended. He was arrested for betraying royal confidences and conspiring against the crown." Lucinda shook her head. "The day after his imprisonment, Prince Jefferson's father died suddenly. The coronation followed, and the prince who had once been kind and just became the hard king we now serve. The pieces were falling into place. A conspiracy more elaborate than Josephine had imagined. She reached into her pocket and withdrew half of a golden medallion. "I've carried this through 20 years of exile," Lucinda gasped. "The royal emblem. The matching piece hangs around the king's neck still, though few ever see it beneath his robes. I need to get closer to him, Lucinda. Not as a servant in the dungeons or archives." The old woman considered for a moment. "The king suffers terrible headaches. Has for years. None of the royal physicians have found lasting relief." She nodded toward the herbs in Josephine's hand. "You mentioned learning healing arts in the East." "Extensive knowledge," Josephine confirmed. "I studied with a master physician for nearly a decade." "That might be your path," Lucinda said thoughtfully. "I'll speak with the head chamberlain, if you can ease the king's suffering where others have failed." A week later, Josephine found herself mixing herbs in a small room adjacent to the royal chambers. Her promotion to assistant healer had raised eyebrows, but the head physician had been desperate enough to try anything after the king's latest debilitating episode. "His Majesty approaches," announced a guard at the door. "Prepare yourself." Josephine straightened her simple healer's robe, heart pounding as Jefferson entered, his face drawn with pain. Without his crown and formal attire, he looked more like the prince she had known, until she met his eyes, now clouded with suspicion and suffering. "So you're the miraculous healer," he said, voice tight. "The servant with the sharp tongue, who now claims to cure what my physicians cannot." Josephine bowed deeply. "I make no grand claims, Your Majesty. I merely offer techniques learned during my time abroad. The same techniques that flavored my food so distinctively before you broke my mother's chalice." His gaze was penetrating despite his obvious discomfort. "Similar principles," she acknowledged. "Eastern medicine treats the body as a whole. Food, drink, balance." Jefferson reluctantly seated himself in the chair she had prepared. "Proceed then, but know that my guards are watching." Josephine worked silently, mixing a potion of herbs steeped in hot water. The familiar scent filled the chamber. Lavender, feverfew, and rarer spices from lands far beyond Highcrest. As she worked, she hummed softly, an old melody without thinking. Jefferson stiffened. "That song, what is it?" Josephine faltered. Realizing her mistake, It was a tune she had often sung in their secret garden, a melody from her childhood, an Eastern healing chant. She lied smoothly. The vibrations helped the medicine's potency. His eyes narrowed, but the pain in his head clearly outweighed his suspicion. Continue. She applied a compress to his temples, her fingers working with practiced precision. Though she tried to maintain professional distance, being this close to him after 20 years sent waves of conflicting emotions through her. Hatred for what he had become, sorrow for what they had lost, and, most troubling, the lingering embers of love that refused to die completely. "You treat with unusual confidence for a kitchen servant," Jefferson observed, eyes closed as her fingers massaged his scalp. "I was assistant to a great physician for many years," she replied, "before the pirate attack that brought me to Highcrest, and the scars. From the same pirates, years earlier, they attacked the merchant ship I was traveling on." Jefferson's eyes opened, studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "There's something familiar about you." Josephine's hand stilled momentarily before resuming their rhythmic movement. "I've been told I resemble someone from your court." "No," he murmured, the pain medication beginning to take effect, making him less guarded. "Something in your movements, your hands." His eyes drifted to her throat, where a thin chain disappeared beneath her robe, the chain holding her half of the medallion. "What's that you wear?" he asked suddenly. "A keepsake," she answered, continuing her treatment. "Nothing of value." To her relief, the door opened as Captain Levi entered. "Your Majesty, the Council awaits your decision on the northern border dispute." Jefferson sighed, the spell broken. He rose from the chair, looking surprised at the absence of pain. "Your methods are effective," he admitted reluctantly. "The relief should last through your council meeting," Josephine told him. "I can prepare another treatment for tonight if the pain returns." "See that you do," Jefferson commanded, but with less harshness than before. As he turned to leave, he added, "You will attend me directly henceforth. No more archives or kitchens." After he departed with Levi, Josephine released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had achieved her goal, access to the king, yet the moment had left her shaken. Despite everything, there remained something of the Jefferson she had loved, glimpses of the man buried beneath the embittered king's facade. That evening, as she prepared fresh medications in her new quarters adjacent to the healing rooms, a knock interrupted her work. Opening the door, she was startled to find Captain Levi standing there, his expression troubled. "Captain," she greeted him cautiously. "Healer Josephine," he replied with a slight bow. "I came to thank you. The king has been more present today than I've seen in months. Whatever you did eased not just his physical pain." Josephine fought to keep her expression neutral as she looked into her son's face. "I'm glad I could help." "There's something else," Levy continued, lowering his voice. "Be careful around Duke Cornelius. He seemed disturbed by your promotion. I don't know why, but my uncle's interest is rarely beneficial for those who attract it. Thank you for the warning," she said softly. Levi hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded and turned to leave. Josephine watched him go, her heart aching with the need to tell him everything. In her hand, she clutched the half-medallion that could prove his birthright, and potentially endanger them all if revealed too soon. Over the next 2 weeks, a cautious rhythm developed between Josephine and King Jefferson. Each morning and evening, she prepared remedies for his headaches, which had diminished significantly under her care. Their sessions remained formal, yet something had shifted, a tentative trust forming through the ritual of healing. "You never speak of your homeland," Jefferson remarked one evening as Josephine mixed herbs with practiced precision. "Where exactly in the east did you study medicine?" "A coastal province called Maioria," she answered, using the name of a place she had indeed spent several years. "After the pirates sold me to a merchant, I was fortunate that his brother was a physician who saw potential in me." "Sold you?" His voice tightened with rare emotion. Josephine kept her gaze on her work. "Many survivors of pirate attacks face such fates, Your Majesty. And yet you return to sea, despite such risks. Some journeys are necessary, regardless of danger." She handed him the steaming cup of medicinal tea. "This contains valerian root to help you sleep without dreams." Jefferson took the cup, his fingers briefly brushing hers. The contact, however fleeting, sent an unwelcome current through her body. "Without dreams," he repeated softly. "A blessing indeed." The vulnerability in his voice almost made her forget 20 years of bitterness. Almost, later that night, Josephine met secretly with Lucinda in the deserted laundry. "I've found nothing in the king's chambers that could prove the conspiracy," Josephine whispered. "No documents, no correspondence. The Queen Mother was too careful for that," Lucinda replied. "But there might be evidence elsewhere. Her private chapel. She spent hours there, especially in her final days." Final days. She died 3 years ago. Some say her conscience troubled her at the end. She refused all visitors except the Duke and her priest. Lucinda hesitated. There were rumors she wrote a confession of some kind. Where would such a document be kept? The chapel has a hidden compartment beneath the altar. The old queen used it for her most private prayers and possessions. This new information stirred hope in Josephine. "Can you get me access?" "The chapel remains sealed since her death. Only the royal family and the Duke have keys." Lucinda's eyes suddenly widened in alarm as she glanced toward the doorway. "Someone's coming." Josephine quickly grabbed a stack of linens, pretending to deliver them as Duke Cornelius appeared in the entrance. His calculating eyes assessed the scene. "A healer among the laundry?" he questioned smoothly. "How versatile your talents are becoming, Josephine." She cursed inwardly, but maintained a composed facade. "I was collecting fresh linens for His Majesty's chambers, Your Excellence." "Indeed." His gaze shifted to Lucinda, who busied herself with folding, "and consulting our eldest servant about the king's preferences, no doubt. The king appreciates certain comforts," Lucinda offered innocently. The Duke stepped closer to Josephine, his voice dropping. "You've risen quickly from kitchen maid to royal healer, quite remarkable for someone who arrived so mysteriously. Fortune favors those with useful skills, Your Excellence, and misfortune finds those who exceed their station." His smile never reached his eyes. "I wonder what secrets you carried aboard that merchant vessel. Perhaps from Highcrest's enemies." "I carry only medical knowledge, my lord." "We shall see." He gestured dismissively. "Carry on with your linens." After he departed, Lucinda clutched Josephine's arm. "He suspects something. You must be more careful, or move more quickly," Josephine countered, determination hardening her features. The following evening, as the castle prepared for a visiting delegation from a neighboring kingdom, an opportunity presented itself. The king would be occupied for hours with diplomatic discussions, and the Duke would be at his side. Josephine prepared Jefferson's pain remedy as usual, but added a careful measure of herbs to ensure he remained clear-headed for negotiations as she delivered it to his chambers. She noticed a ring of keys on his desk, including one ornate key she suspected might open the sealed chapel. "Your remedy, Your Majesty," she announced, setting down the tray. Jefferson emerged from his dressing room, royal regalia half-fastened. Without his attendants present, he appeared oddly vulnerable. "Assist me with these clasps," he commanded. "My usual attendant is ill." Josephine approached cautiously, her fingers working the intricate gold fastenings of his ceremonial cloak. Standing this close, she caught the familiar scent of him, older, mingled now with costly perfumes, but underneath still the same. "You have skilled hands," he observed. "Years of precise work with medicines," she replied, desperate to maintain professional distance despite their proximity. "Your remedies have proven more effective than any court physician's." His voice softened slightly. "I find myself clearer of mind these past weeks." "I'm pleased to hear it, Your Majesty." As she finished with the clasps, she deliberately knocked over a small vial on the nearby table. "Forgive me." While he turned to assess the spill, she swiftly palmed the chapel key from the ring, replacing it with a similar-looking key from her pocket, one she had carefully prepared after Lucinda's description. "No harm done," Jefferson said, surprisingly patient. "It's merely water." Josephine tidied the spill, heart racing at the stolen key concealed in her sleeve. "I shall return later to prepare your evening remedy." "See that you do." His gaze lingered on her face for a moment. "These diplomatic functions are tedious at best." She bowed and retreated, the weight of the key burning against her skin. Hours later, with most of the castle focused on the diplomatic reception, Josephine slipped along shadowed corridors toward the sealed chapel. The key fit perfectly, turning with a soft click that sounded thunderous in the silence. The Queen Mother's private chapel was small but opulent, dust-covering surfaces untouched for years. Stained glass windows cast colored moonlight across a marble altar. Following Lucinda's instructions, Josephine pressed a hidden lever beneath a carved angel's wing, revealing a small compartment. Inside lay a sealed letter and a small journal bound in red leather. As Josephine reached for them, a voice froze her in place. "I wondered how long it would take you to find this place." She whirled to find Captain Levi standing in the doorway, hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "Captain," she acknowledged, mind racing for explanations. "Few know this chapel exists," he continued, stepping inside and closing the door. Fewer still would risk stealing a royal key to enter it. His eyes reflected disappointment and confusion. "Why are you here, Healer Josephine?" Before she could answer, shouting erupted from the distant Great Hall. Guards called for the captain as servants ran through corridors. "What's happening?" Josephine asked, grateful for the interruption. Levi hesitated, torn between duty and confronting her trespass. "We'll continue this discussion later," he decided. Turning toward the commotion, Josephine followed, hastily pocketing the journal and letter. As they neared the Great Hall, the chaos became clear. King Jefferson had collapsed during the diplomatic dinner. "Poison!" someone shouted. The hall was in pandemonium. Jefferson lay on the stone floor, his face ashen, body convulsing. Duke Cornelius knelt beside him, shouting orders to guards. "The healer!" Levi called, pulling Josephine forward. "Let her through!" Josephine rushed to Jefferson's side, professional instincts overriding everything else. She checked his symptoms: dilated pupils, foaming saliva, the distinctive bitter almond scent on his breath. "White shade," she diagnosed immediately, naming a rare poison. "I need my supplies quickly." As servants ran to fetch her remedies, Duke Cornelius leaned close, his voice a menacing whisper. "How convenient that you can identify such an obscure poison so readily. I can save him or defend myself, Your Excellence, but not both at once," she replied sharply, focusing on loosening Jefferson's collar. The Duke retreated slightly, but remained watchful as Josephine worked frantically to counteract the poison. When her remedies arrived, she mixed them with practiced efficiency, forcing the concoction down Jefferson's throat. For terrible minutes, nothing happened. Then the king gasped, color slowly returning to his face as the convulsion subsided. "He needs rest," Josephine announced, "and constant monitoring." As guards carefully moved Jefferson to his chambers, he briefly regained consciousness, his gaze finding Josephine. "Hope," he murmured feverishly before slipping back into unconsciousness. The single word sent shockwaves through those nearby. Duke Cornelius's face darkened with suspicion. While Levi looked confused, Josephine kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered in her chest. Throughout the night, she tended Jefferson as he drifted between consciousness and delirium. During his fevered moments, he spoke of the past, of broken promises and endless searching. "I never believed you betrayed me," he whispered once, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I looked for you in every face." Josephine fought back tears as she applied cool cloths to his forehead. "Rest, Your Majesty. The poison still speaks through you." In the corner of the room, Captain Levi stood guard, his thoughtful gaze moving between the king and his healer, pieces of a puzzle slowly assembling in his mind. Dawn filtered through the heavy curtains as King Jefferson finally slipped into natural sleep. The worst of the poison neutralized. Josephine's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. She had worked through the night, preparing antidotes and monitoring his vital signs with unwavering attention. "You should rest," Captain Levi said, approaching from his post by the door. "I'll have another healer take watch." "No," Josephine replied firmly. "The treatment is delicate. Any mistake could trigger a relapse." Levi studied her with a calculating gaze that reminded her painfully of Jefferson in his youth. "You saved his life." Even the court physicians admitted they wouldn't have recognized white shade so quickly. "Experience comes in unexpected forms," she answered evasively, "like breaking into the Queen Mother's sealed chapel." His voice remained low, but the question hung dangerously between them. Before she could respond, Jefferson stirred, drawing her attention back to her patient. Levi retreated, but his expression made it clear their conversation wasn't over. Throughout the morning, nobles and advisors came to inquire about the king's condition. The assassination attempt had sent shockwaves through the castle. Guards had been doubled, and food testers scrutinized every morsel intended for the royal table. Duke Cornelius appeared mid-morning, accompanied by 2 personal guards. His face was a careful mask of concern, but his eyes betrayed calculation as they assessed both the sleeping king and his exhausted healer. "How fortunate that you possess such specific knowledge of obscure poisons," he remarked, circling toward Josephine like a predator. "One might almost suspect prior familiarity. One might thank the heavens instead that His Majesty had access to such knowledge," she countered, continuing to mix fresh medicine. "The poison would have killed him within the hour otherwise." "Indeed, most convenient timing." The Duke's voice hardened. "You appeared in our kingdom following a pirate attack, rose swiftly from kitchen maid to royal healer, and happened to be present for a rare poisoning you could miraculously treat. Quite the sequence of fortunate events." Josephine met his gaze steadily. "Or perhaps just the right person in the right place. Your Excellence. We shall see. I've ordered an investigation into the assassination attempt." His smile was cold. "Every person with access to the king will be thoroughly examined, including foreign healers with mysterious pasts," after he departed. Josephine clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. The Duke's suspicions were dangerous, but she had anticipated them. What troubled her more was the growing awareness in Levi's eyes, and the name Jefferson had called her in his delirium. Late that afternoon, Lucinda slipped into the royal chambers under the pretense of delivering fresh linens. "The entire castle speaks of nothing but the poisoning," she whispered, arranging bedding while Josephine prepared herbs. "And of how you saved him." "The Duke suspects me," Josephine murmured. "Josephine, of course he does. You threaten everything he's built." Lucinda glanced nervously at the sleeping king. "Did you find anything in the chapel?" Josephine nodded minutely. "A journal and a letter. I haven't had a moment to examine them. Be careful. The Duke's men are watching your every move." The old woman hesitated. "There's something else. Captain Levy has been asking questions. About hope. About the time when the prince's heart was broken." Josephine's hands stilled. "What kind of questions?" "About her appearance. Her relationship with the prince. He even asked if any portraits of her existed." Lucinda's voice dropped further. "And he's been studying old records of royal births from 20 years ago." A chill ran through Josephine. The pieces were aligning too quickly. Before she was ready, after Lucinda left, Josephine checked that Jefferson still slept deeply before retrieving the stolen items from their hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. The journal was the Queen Mother's private diary, its pages filled with elegant script detailing court intrigues and personal observations. Josephine quickly skimmed until entries from 20 years prior caught her eye. "The prince's infatuation with the merchant girl grows more concerning daily. Today he spoke of abdicating rather than giving her up. I cannot allow a common trader's daughter to destroy generations of carefully cultivated alliances. Cornelius suggests a permanent solution to our problem." Heart-pounding, Josephine turned to the sealed letter. The wax seal bore the Queen Mother's personal crest. She broke it carefully and unfolded the parchment. "To whomever finds this after my passing. As death approaches, I find my conscience can no longer bear the weight of past sins. 20 years ago, I conspired with Duke Cornelius to separate Prince Jefferson from Hope Fletcher, the commoner he loved. The girl was not unfaithful as we claimed. She was drugged, abducted, and taken from the kingdom against her will. More grievous still, when she was discovered to be with child, the prince's heir, she was kept prisoner until delivery. The infant boy was brought to court under the pretense of being Cornelius's orphaned nephew, while his mother was sold to Eastern slavers, presumed never to return. May God forgive what I cannot undo. The boy, Levi, is the true heir to the throne, born of royal blood and true love. I leave this confession as my final act of contrition." Queen Mother Eleonora Josephine's hands trembled as she read the confession that confirmed everything. At last, she had proof, written testimony from the Queen Mother herself. So it's true. She whirled to find Levi standing in the doorway of the antechamber, his face pale with shock. How long he had been there, what he had seen, she couldn't know. "Captain," she began, "I followed you. he admitted, stepping inside and closing the door. "After finding you in the chapel, after hearing the king call you Hope in his delirium, I needed answers." His eyes fixed on the letter in her hand. "What is that document?" Josephine's mind raced, calculating risks and possibilities. Perhaps it was time for truth, or at least part of it. "Evidence of a conspiracy," she said carefully, "against the king, and against a woman he once loved. Hope Fletcher," Levi stated flatly, "the woman whose name he spoke while poisoned. The woman the Duke told me was a traitor who broke the prince's heart." Josephine hesitated, then made her decision. "Would you like to know the truth, Captain? About Hope? About the Duke? About yourself?" Something shifted in Levi's expression. Recognition. Perhaps of a moment that would forever change his life. "Yes," he answered simply. Josephine handed him the Queen Mother's confession. She watched his face as he read, witnessing the cascade of emotions: disbelief, anger, confusion, and finally a stunned acceptance. "I am the king's son," he whispered, looking up with Jefferson's emerald eyes. "And my mother wasn't a foreign noblewoman, but this Hope Fletcher." "Yes," Josephine confirmed, her throat tight with unspoken truths. "And she's alive, somewhere in the Eastern Territories." Hope kindled in his expression, the hope of a child who had grown up without a mother's love. Before Josephine could respond, a weak voice came from the royal bedchamber. "Josephine." Both turned to see King Jefferson attempting to sit up, his face still pale from the poison, but his eyes clear and alert. He looked between them, noting the tension and the document in Levi's hand. "What conspiracy unfolds in my own chambers while I fight death?" he demanded. Though his voice lacked strength, Levi looked from the letter to Josephine, silently questioning how to proceed. In that moment of hesitation, the door burst open as Duke Cornelius entered with 4 armed guards. "Your Majesty, thank the heavens you're awake," the Duke exclaimed, though his expression suggested anything but relief. His gaze hardened when he saw the letter in Levi's hand and the diary on the table beside Josephine. "I see you've discovered our healer's true purpose. She's been searching for documents to falsify, plotting against the crown." "That's not true," Levi started, but the Duke cut him off. "Guards, arrest this woman. She is suspected not only of stealing royal property, but of administering the poison she so miraculously cured." As the guards moved to seize her, Josephine locked eyes with Jefferson. "Ask him about Hope," she said clearly. "Ask your trusted advisor what really happened 20 years ago." The king's face went rigid with shock. "What do you know of Hope?" But the guards had already taken her arms, dragging her toward the door as Levi stood frozen between loyalty to the crown and the stunning revelations he had just discovered. "Your Majesty, she's clearly delusional," the Duke said smoothly. "The stress of treating your poisoning has unhinged her mind." "Wait," Jefferson commanded, his voice regaining its authority. "Bring her to me." The room stilled as the guards hesitated between the king's direct order and the Duke's accusations. In that moment of tension, Lucinda appeared at the doorway, her aged face determined as she clutched a small wooden box. "Perhaps this will help your Majesty see the truth," she announced, stepping forward with unexpected boldness. "I've kept it hidden since the night Hope disappeared." The room fell silent as Lucinda approached the king's bedside. Guards exchanged uncertain glances, while Duke Cornelius's face darkened with barely concealed fury. "This servant oversteps her bounds," he snarled. "Remove her at once." "Stay," Jefferson commanded, his voice weak but authoritative. He studied the elderly laundress with narrowed eyes. "You were Hope's confidant, weren't you, before she left?" "I was, Your Majesty," Lucinda confirmed, clutching the wooden box protectively. "And she entrusted this to me the day she disappeared, asking me to keep it safe until she returned." She cast a meaningful glance toward Josephine. She feared something might happen to prevent their midnight rendezvous. Jefferson's gaze darted between Lucinda, the mysterious box, and Josephine, whose arms were still restrained by the guards. His face betrayed a complex war of emotions: hope, suspicion, and the deeply ingrained bitterness of 2 decades. "Your Majesty," the Duke interjected smoothly, "we waste precious time with these distractions while your life remains in danger. The poisoner must be..." Silence. Jefferson's hand slammed against the bedside table. sending medicine vials rattling. "I will hear what the woman has to say." He nodded to Lucinda. "Show me." With trembling fingers, Lucinda opened the box. Inside lay a pressed white rose, now brown with age, and a small portrait miniature painted on ivory. Jefferson reached for it with an unsteady hand, staring at the delicate likeness of a young woman with auburn hair and a gentle smile. "Hope," he whispered, the single word laden with 20 years of loss. "Look closer, Your Majesty," Lucinda urged softly. "Not at what has changed, but at what remains the same." Jefferson's gaze lifted to Josephine's scarred face, studying her with new intensity. Beyond the weathered skin and premature gray, beyond the jagged scar that twisted her features, he searched for something only he would recognize. "Release her," he ordered suddenly. "Your Majesty, I must protest." Duke Cornelius stepped forward. "This is clearly an elaborate deception." "I said release her." Jefferson's voice cracked with emotion. "Now." The guards reluctantly loosened their grip on Josephine's arms. Free from restraint, she reached beneath her healer's robe and withdrew the half-medallion hanging from its chain. The sight of it struck Jefferson like a physical blow. His hand moved to his own chest, where beneath his nightshirt hung its matching piece, the other half of a promise broken 20 years ago. "Impossible," he breathed. "I never betrayed you," Josephine said softly, her carefully maintained accent slipping away. "I was taken, drugged on my way to meet you. The letter was forged, the witnesses paid to lie." Duke Cornelius's face had gone deathly pale. He shifted subtly, positioning himself closer to the exit. "Your Majesty, this woman has clearly researched your past to manipulate your emotions. The resemblance is a cruel trick, nothing more." "Then explain this, Uncle," Levi interjected, stepping forward with the Queen Mother's confession letter extended. "Explain why your name features prominently in a conspiracy to separate the prince from the woman he loved, and to hide the existence of their child." Jefferson's eyes widened. "Child? What child?" "Your son," Josephine answered, her gaze shifting meaningfully to Levi. A leaden silence fell over the chamber, as understanding dawned on Jefferson's face. He looked at Levi with new eyes, seeing for the first time what had been before him for years, the unmistakable combination of his own features with Hope's smile, the same determined tilt of the chin. "Guards, seize the Duke," Jefferson commanded, struggling to rise from his sickbed. "He is guilty of treason against the crown." Cornelius, however, had anticipated this moment. With surprising agility for his age, he drew a concealed dagger and grabbed the nearest guard, pressing the blade to the man's throat. "Stay back," he warned, edging toward the door. "2 decades of planning will not unravel so easily." "Planning," Jefferson echoed, his voice dangerous. "What planning, Cornelius?" The Duke's composure cracked, revealing the ambition that had driven him for 20 years. "You were never meant to be king. Your brother was the worthy heir, strong, decisive, unburdened by foolish sentimentality. When he died in that hunting accident, the crown should have passed to me as his closest advisor, not to a lovesick boy willing to throw away a kingdom for a commoner. So you separated us," Josephine said, the final pieces falling into place. "And when you discovered I was with child, a complication," Cornelius admitted, still backing toward the exit, "but one that provided unexpected opportunity, the child of royal blood, raised under my influence, groomed to take the throne when the time was right." His gaze shifted to Levi. "You were to be my legacy, boy, the puppet king through whom I would finally rule." Levi's hand went to his sword hilt. "I am no one's puppet. You're whatever I made you," the Duke spat. "Every skill you possess, every honor you've earned, all part of my design. Did you think it coincidence that you rose so quickly through the ranks, that the king took such special interest in your career? I made sure you were always in his sight, a constant reminder of the woman he lost, though he never realized why your presence disturbed him so." "Enough," Jefferson roared, fully upright now despite his weakened state. "You will pay for these crimes with your life." The Duke's face contorted with contempt. "Always the same, Jefferson. Quick to rage, slow to think. Your poisoning was merely the first act. Even now, my allies move through the castle, securing key positions. By nightfall, my most loyal supporters will control the gates, the treasury, the armory." He smiled coldly. "The tragic tale of how grief drove you to madness after a failed assassination attempt, how you executed loyal servants based on a fever dream, and the manipulations of a scarred foreign witch, will be recorded by royal historians as the official account." During this exchange, Josephine had been silently calculating. With a subtle movement, she reached for a small vial hidden among her medicinal supplies. In one fluid motion, she uncorked it and flung the contents at the Duke's face. Cornelius howled as the liquid, a potent Eastern eye irritant, struck its target. He released his hostage, slashing blindly with his dagger as he staggered back. "Seize him!" Jefferson commanded again, but in the confusion, the Duke fumbled his way to a concealed side door, a servant's passage, and disappeared. Guards rushed after him, but it would take time to search the labyrinthine passages that honeycombed the castle walls. "Secure the royal chambers," Levi ordered the remaining guards. "No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization, and spread the word to trusted officers only. The Duke's supporters must be identified and contained before they realize their master's plan has been exposed." As the guards hurried to comply, the room emptied until only Jefferson, Josephine, Levi, and Lucinda remained. An awkward silence descended. 20 years of secrets and lies suddenly laid bare. "Hope," Jefferson finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it truly you? What remains of her?" Josephine answered softly. "The girl you knew died in many ways during her captivity. And you," Jefferson turned to Levi, "are my son, my own blood, raised before my eyes as another man's nephew." Levi stood rigidly, his training as a soldier warring with the emotional turbulence of discovering his true identity. "It appears so, Your Majesty." "Father," Jefferson corrected, the word strange on his lips. "If what we've learned is true, you should call me father." The young captain swallowed hard but couldn't bring himself to respond. Instead, he bowed stiffly. "I should organize our defenses. The Duke's supporters will act soon if he doesn't return to give orders." As Levi departed to coordinate the castle's security, Lucinda discreetly withdrew, leaving Josephine and Jefferson alone with 2 decades of pain between them. "You survived," Jefferson said simply, studying her scarred face with undisguised wonder. "All these years, I thought, that I had betrayed you," Josephine finished for him. "I know it was easier to believe that than to keep searching." His face contorted with remorse. "I did search for months. I turned the kingdom upside down looking for you. But the evidence, fabricated by those you trusted most," she said, her voice devoid of accusation. "It was simply a fact, one of many truths they would have to face together." Outside the royal chambers, the castle stirred with unusual activity as Levi's trusted guards quietly took control of strategic positions. The Duke had disappeared into the warren of secret passages, but his plan was now exposed, and the final confrontation had only been delayed, not prevented. The celebration of the king's 50th birthday, scheduled for the following evening, would now become the backdrop for a very different kind of reckoning. Morning broke over Highcrest Castle with an uneasy silence, despite the chaos unfolding behind the scenes. Preparations for the king's birthday celebration continued. Jefferson had insisted upon it, the perfect trap for the Duke's co-conspirators. "We must maintain the appearance of normalcy," he explained to the small council of trusted advisors gathered in his private chambers. Though still weak from the poisoning, he sat upright in a chair by the window, dressed in informal royal attire. "Let them believe their plan proceeds undetected." Captain Levi stood at attention nearby, his face a careful mask of professionalism, despite the emotional turmoil beneath. "My men have secured the armory and main gates, Your Majesty. We've identified several officers loyal to the Duke, but there are surely others we've missed." "And Cornelius himself?" Jefferson asked. "No sign yet. The secret passages are extensive. He could be hiding anywhere in the castle, or may have escaped beyond the walls entirely." Josephine, who had been mixing strengthening tonics at a side table, spoke without turning. "He hasn't fled. His ambition wouldn't allow it." Jefferson's gaze lingered on her back, in the hours since her identity had been revealed. They had spoken little of personal matters, focusing instead on the immediate threat. The weight of 20 years hung between them, too heavy for hasty words. "I agree," he said finally. "Cornelius will make his move tonight, during the celebration when all the kingdom's nobles are gathered." The council meeting concluded with detailed security arrangements. As the advisors filed out, Jefferson called for Levi to remain. Josephine made to leave as well, but the king stopped her. "Stay, please. This concerns you both." An uncomfortable silence settled as the three studied one another. A family fractured before it had even formed. Now thrown together by crisis. "I owe you both more than I can express." Jefferson began awkwardly. 20 years of truths denied, of relationships that should have been. Levi's posture remained rigid. "With respect, Your Majesty, we have a coup to prevent. Personal matters can wait. They've waited 20 years, Jefferson countered, and may never have another chance if tonight goes poorly. His face softened as he looked at the young captain. His son. "I saw your mother in you from the moment you joined my guard. It troubled me, though I never understood why until now." Levi's composure cracked slightly. "I grew up believing I was an orphan, fortunate to have a generous uncle who took me in. Every achievement, every advancement, I thought I'd earned through merit." His voice tightened. "Now I learn it was all manipulation, a plot using me as a pawn." "Not all," Josephine interjected softly. "Your abilities, your character, those are your own. Cornelius may have created opportunities, but you rose to them through genuine talent, a talent inherited from both your parents," Jefferson added. "Your mother's intelligence and my tactical mind." Levi finally met his father's gaze directly. "And what happens after tonight? If we survive this coup attempt, will you acknowledge me publicly as your son? The kingdom would never accept a bastard prince whose mother is—" He stopped abruptly, glancing at Josephine. "A commoner," she finished for him, her scarred face unreadable. "A former slave with no noble blood." Jefferson stood, crossing the room with deliberate steps despite his weakness. "They will accept what their king decrees." He placed a hand on Levi's shoulder. "But first, we must ensure there is still a kingdom to rule." By evening, the great hall blazed with hundreds of candles. Nobles from across Highcrest arrived in their finest attire, unaware of the undercurrents of tension beneath the festive atmosphere. Guards selected by Levi personally stood at strategic positions, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Jefferson made a calculated late entrance, wanting to appear fully recovered from what the court had been told was a brief illness. He wore ceremonial regalia that concealed light armor beneath, a sword at his hip despite the informal nature of the occasion. The court rose in unison, bowing as he entered. Murmurs of appreciation and relief spread through the crowd. Their king appeared hale and vibrant on his 50th birthday, with practiced regal confidence. Jefferson addressed his assembled subjects. "My loyal nobles, trusted advisors, and honored guests, I welcome you to this celebration not just of my 50 years of life, but of Highcrest's continued prosperity and strength." As he spoke, his eyes scanned the crowd, noting which faces showed genuine pleasure at his recovery and which concealed calculation. Several of the Duke's known associates were present, though conspicuously scattered throughout the hall rather than grouped together. "Some of you may have heard rumors of my recent indisposition," Jefferson continued smoothly. "Rest assured, it was merely a passing ailment, skillfully treated by our new court healer." On cue, Josephine entered from a side door. Transformed from the simple healer of recent weeks, she wore a modest but elegant gown of deep green that complemented her gray-streaked hair, which had been arranged to partially conceal her facial scar. The court's reaction was mixed. Some nodded respectfully toward the woman credited with saving the king's life, while others whispered behind jeweled hands as the formal dinner commenced. Jefferson maintained the appearance of a king enjoying his celebration, though he ate and drank nothing that wasn't first tasted by trusted servants. Levi patrolled the perimeter of the hall, exchanging subtle signals with his loyal guards. Midway through the evening, a steward approached the high table, bowing low. "Your Majesty, Duke Cornelius sends his deepest apologies for his absence and this birthday tribute." He presented an ornate box, which Jefferson regarded with well-concealed suspicion. How thoughtful of my oldest advisor to remember. Despite being unexpectedly called away on urgent business, the steward blinked in confusion. "Called away, Your Majesty. The Duke instructed me to say he was delayed by last-minute preparations for this very gift." Jefferson exchanged a quick glance with Levi before turning back to the steward. "Of course, a simple misunderstanding." He gestured for the box to be placed on the table, untouched, as the festivities continued. Tension mounted among those aware of the true situation. The Duke's absence could mean only that his plan was in motion elsewhere. Josephine observed the room carefully, noting which nobles seemed distracted or checked timepieces with unusual frequency. At precisely the hour when the formal toast were to begin, the great doors of the hall burst open. Duke Cornelius strode in, flanked by a dozen armed men bearing the insignia of a neighboring kingdom. Mercenaries hired for this exact purpose. The music died abruptly as guests gasped and drew back. Jefferson rose slowly from his seat, hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "Cornelius," he greeted evenly. "How kind of you to join us after all." The Duke's face showed signs of the previous day's encounter. Reddened eyes from Josephine's potion and a new hardness to his expression. Behind him, more armed men filtered into the hall. "Forgive my dramatic entrance, Your Majesty," Cornelius announced, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent room. "But I bring grave news that cannot wait. News of treason in the very heart of your court." "Treason?" Jefferson raised an eyebrow, maintaining his composure. "Yes, Your Majesty." The Duke stepped forward, his voice dropping to a tone of rehearsed concern. "It pains me deeply to report that you have been deceived by impostors and conspirators." He turned toward the assembled nobles. "My loyal friends, our beloved king has fallen victim to a plot so insidious it threatens the very foundation of our kingdom." With theatrical timing, he pointed directly at Josephine. "This woman is not merely a healer, but a foreign agent who has poisoned His Majesty's mind with Eastern potions. She has convinced him of an outrageous fiction, that she is Hope Fletcher, the commoner girl who betrayed the prince's love 20 years ago." Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Jefferson remained silent, allowing the Duke to continue digging his own grave. "More shocking still," Cornelius declared, voice rising. "She claims that Captain Levi is the illegitimate son of the king, born of that illicit union and hidden all these years." He shook his head in feigned sadness. "The poison that nearly took our king's life has left him susceptible to these manipulations." Confusing fever dreams with reality. The Duke drew himself up, face solemn. "For the safety of the realm, and the king's own protection until his mind clears, I must temporarily assume stewardship of the kingdom." At this declaration, his mercenaries moved into position. Surrounding the high table, Levi's loyal guards tensed, hands on weapons, awaiting the signal to act. Jefferson finally spoke, his voice dangerously calm. "Are you quite finished, Cornelius?" A hush fell over the great hall as King Jefferson rose to his full height, his eyes never leaving Duke Cornelius. The assembled nobles froze in place, caught between loyalty to their monarch and fear of the armed mercenaries now stationed throughout the room. "You speak of treason, Cornelius," Jefferson said, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner. "How fitting that you should be the one to name it." The Duke's confident smile faltered slightly. "Your Majesty is clearly still affected by the poisoning. These delusions are not delusions at all," Jefferson interrupted. He reached inside his formal robes and withdrew a folded document bearing the royal seal. "This morning, I had my scribes make copies of a most interesting letter, one written by my mother on her deathbed." Cornelius paled visibly. "A forgery, obviously planted by these conspirators. Strange, then, that it bears not only her seal, but also her unique penmanship, verified by 3 court scholars who knew her hand well." Jefferson unfolded the letter. "Shall I read it aloud? Or would you prefer to confess your crimes yourself?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, as nobles exchanged uncertain glances. Cornelius assessed the room quickly, noting which of his supporters were still in position, though visibly shaken. He hadn't survived decades of court intrigue by surrendering easily. "Even if such a letter exists," he countered, gesturing dismissively, "it proves nothing except that your mother was manipulated in her final days. This woman," he pointed accusingly at Josephine, "cannot possibly be Hope Fletcher. Look at her, a scarred foreigner with gray hair and Eastern ways. Hope was a fresh-faced girl of 19 when she fled the kingdom. 20 years of slavery and hardship change a person, Cornelius." Josephine spoke for the first time, her voice steady. "As you well knew when you arranged for my abduction and sale to Eastern merchants." She stepped forward, pulling the half-medallion from beneath her gown. "But some things cannot be taken, no matter how deeply you scar the flesh." Jefferson removed his own half-medallion, the match to hers. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as the significance became clear. "Still not convinced?" Josephine challenged, her eyes scanning the assembled nobles. "Then perhaps you'll believe this." She turned to Lucinda, who had positioned herself near the high table. "Bring forward Sir Thomas." The elderly laundress disappeared briefly, before returning with the former royal advisor, who had been secretly released from his cell and prepared for this moment. Though frail from his years of imprisonment, Sir Thomas stood straight-backed as he faced the court. "I, Sir Thomas Edmund, former High Advisor to the Crown, bear witness that this woman is indeed Hope Fletcher," he announced, his voice wavering but clear. "I arranged their secret meetings 20 years ago and was imprisoned for continuing to investigate her disappearance after the Queen Mother ordered the search abandoned." Duke Cornelius's face contorted with fury. "This is absurd. You expect the court to believe this theatrical display over 20 years of known history?" "I expect them to believe evidence and testimony," Jefferson replied calmly, "including that of my most trusted captain of the guard." All eyes turned to Levi, who stood at perfect attention in his ceremonial uniform. For a moment, the young captain's composure wavered as he faced not just his duty, but the truth of his own identity. "I have examined the evidence myself," he stated, military training steadying his voice, "and I have confirmed through multiple sources that I am not the Duke's nephew as I was raised to believe, but the son of King Jefferson and Hope Fletcher, hidden and manipulated as part of the Duke's long-term plot to control the throne." Cornelius laughed, though the sound held a desperate edge. "And you believe this fantastic tale simply because a scarred foreigner and a disgraced advisor make the claim?" He turned to the assembled nobles. "My lords and ladies, can you not see this for what it is? A calculated move to install an illegitimate heir and his common-born mother into the royal line?" Several nobles shifted uncomfortably, the deeply ingrained prejudices of their class warring with the evidence before them. Sensing their hesitation, Cornelius pressed his advantage. "Even if, by some remote chance, this woman was once Hope Fletcher, and this captain is their offspring, what then? Would you have Highcrest ruled by a queen who spent decades in foreign lands, learning who knows what Eastern sorcery? Would you accept a bastard prince with no proper royal training?" His voice rose with practiced authority. "Our kingdom would become the laughingstock of the realm. Our alliances would crumble." Some nobles nodded in agreement, and Cornelius's confidence visibly grew. He strode forward, every inch the statesman who had guided the kingdom for decades. "Your Majesty," he addressed Jefferson with mock respect, "your heart has overruled your judgment. For the good of Highcrest, step aside and allow the council to determine the proper succession until your mind clears." In that moment of uncertainty, as the court wavered, Josephine made her decision. She stepped forward into the center of the hall, commanding attention not through royal privilege, but through the sheer force of her presence. "You speak of proper succession and royal training," she addressed the assembled nobility directly. "Yet you forget that the true measure of a ruler is not in their bloodline, but in their actions." She gestured toward Levi. "This young man has served Highcrest with honor and distinction. Even Duke Cornelius admits he personally supervised his education, though for his own corrupt purposes." She turned slowly, meeting the eyes of nobles she had once known in her youth. "Many of you remember me from before. You danced at my father's seasonal festivals when he imported rare spices from across the sea. You came to our gardens to admire flowers that grew nowhere else in Highcrest." Her scarred features softened with memory. "And you witnessed how Prince Jefferson's love for a merchant's daughter transformed him from a dutiful but distant heir into a prince who cared deeply about all his subjects, regardless of their birth." Jefferson stepped forward to stand beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "The woman I loved was taken from me through treachery. The son I never knew was raised before my eyes as another man's kin. 20 years of bitterness and hard rule followed. Years that might have been very different had the rightful course of succession not been interfered with." Duke Cornelius recognized the tide turning against him. With a subtle signal to his mercenaries, he made his final desperate move. "Enough of this farce," he shouted. "Seize the king for his own protection." The hall erupted into chaos as mercenaries surged forward, but Levi had anticipated this moment. His loyal guards emerged from strategic positions throughout the hall, engaging the mercenaries before they could reach the royal dais. Steel clashed against steel as nobles scattered for safety. Cornelius himself drew a concealed crossbow from beneath his elaborate cloak and aimed directly at Jefferson. "If I cannot rule through you," he snarled, "I will rule through your memory." Josephine saw the weapon rise. Without hesitation, she threw herself in front of Jefferson just as Cornelius fired. The bolt struck her in the shoulder, the impact throwing her backward against the king. "Hope." Jefferson caught her as she fell, lowering her gently to the ground as blood spread across the green fabric of her gown. Levi's roar of rage cut through the tumult of battle. In 3 swift strides, he reached the Duke, disarming him with a precise strike that sent the older man sprawling. "It's over, Uncle," he said coldly. Sword tip pressed against Cornelius's throat. The Duke's mercenaries, seeing their employer defeated and significantly outnumbered by loyal guards, quickly surrendered within moments. The fighting ceased, leaving only the sound of Josephine's labored breathing as Jefferson cradled her in his arms. "The arrow!" she gasped, her face contorted with pain. "Poisoned! I can taste it!" "No," Jefferson whispered, the single word containing 2 decades of loss threatening to repeat itself. "Not again. I won't lose you again." Blood leaked from the corner of Josephine's mouth, a telltale sign of white shade, the same poison used against Jefferson days earlier. Her eyes found Levi, who had rushed to her side. "My son," she managed, reaching for his hand with trembling fingers. "At least, I got to see you grown, to know you became a good man." As her eyes fluttered closed, Jefferson clutched her hand desperately, their half-medallions pressing together, nearly whole again, but still broken. "Don't you dare leave me," Jefferson commanded, his voice cracking with emotion as he cradled Josephine's limp form. "Not when I've just found you again." Levi knelt beside them, face pale with shock. "The royal physician!" "No," Jefferson cut him off. "White shade works too quickly. Only one person in this castle knows the antidote." His eyes never left Josephine's ashen face. "And she's dying in my arms." A strange calm settled over the king. With gentle precision, he gathered Josephine against his chest and stood, his royal authority silencing any who might have objected. "Where are her healing supplies?" he demanded of the stunned court. "In her chambers," Lucinda answered quickly. "I'll show you." "Secure the Duke," Jefferson ordered Levi. "Then join us immediately." The assembled nobility parted as their king carried the wounded woman from the hall, not as a monarch bearing a subject, but as a man desperately clutching his heart's missing half. In Josephine's healing chambers, Jefferson laid her carefully on the bed. Her breathing had grown shallow, her skin clammy and pale. "Her medicines," he urged Lucinda, who was already searching through bottles and pouches. "I don't know which ones," the old woman admitted tearfully. "She never taught me." Levi burst through the door, his captain's composure momentarily replaced by the fear of a child about to lose a mother he'd only just discovered. "The Duke is secured. What can I do?" Jefferson's gaze fixed on the workbench covered with Eastern herbs and instruments. "Help me search." She prepared the antidote for me. There might be notes, ingredients set aside. They worked frantically, scouring jars and scrolls for any clue. While Josephine's breathing grew more labored, Jefferson found himself praying to gods he'd long since stopped believing in, promising anything, his crown, his life, for a few more moments with her. "Here," Levi exclaimed suddenly, holding up a small leather-bound journal. "Poison remedies, and white shade is marked." Jefferson snatched the book, scanning the careful diagrams and instructions written in Josephine's precise hand. "These ingredients," he pointed to a list. Quickly, working together, father and son crushed herbs, heated liquids, and combined elements according to the journal's instructions. Their movements were synchronized despite never having collaborated before, Jefferson measuring precise amounts while Levi controlled the small flame heating the mixture. "It needs to cool for 1 minute, then be administered immediately," Jefferson read aloud, his hands trembling slightly as he poured the antidote into a small cup. The seconds stretched like years as they watched the liquid cool. When the time came, Levi gently lifted Josephine's head while Jefferson carefully tipped the medicine between her pale lips. "Swallow," he whispered, stroking her throat to encourage the reflexive action. "Please, Hope, swallow." Her body responded automatically, the liquid disappearing in small gulps. Then, nothing. She lay motionless, her breathing so faint it was barely perceptible. "How long?" Levi asked hoarsely. Jefferson checked the journal. "It doesn't say." They settled into an agonizing vigil. Minutes stretched to hours as the night deepened outside. Nobles and servants alike gathered in the corridor, waiting for news that would determine Highcrest's future. Inside the chamber, a king and his newly discovered son sat on either side of a bed, each holding one of Josephine's hands, neither willing to acknowledge the possibility of failure. Near dawn, when hope had begun to fade, Josephine's fingers twitched slightly in Jefferson's grasp. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened, confusion giving way to recognition as she focused on his face. "You've looked better," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A sound escaped Jefferson, half laugh, half sob. "And you've looked worse," Levi exhaled sharply, 20 years of royal training insufficient to hide his relief. The antidote worked. Josephine turned toward him, a weak smile touching her lips. "Of course it did. I made it." Recovery came slowly. The poison had taken a severe toll, and for several days, Josephine drifted between consciousness and fevered sleep. Jefferson refused to leave her side, conducting essential kingdom business from her chambers, despite the court's disapproval. Duke Cornelius languished in the same cell that had once held Sir Thomas, awaiting judgment. His mercenaries had been expelled from the kingdom, while nobles who had supported his conspiracy faced trials and forfeitures of lands on the 7th day after the confrontation. When Josephine was finally strong enough to sit up, Jefferson made an unprecedented announcement to his assembled advisors. "I intend to abdicate the throne," he declared, silencing the room instantly. "Your Majesty," the Lord Chancellor protested, "this is most irregular. If this is about legitimizing your relationship with the healer, it is about far more than that," Jefferson interrupted. 20 years ago, I was willing to give up the crown for love, had I been allowed to make that choice freely. Highcrest might have had a very different ruler, perhaps a better one. My brother might still live. Thousands of decisions I made from bitterness rather than wisdom might have been avoided. He stood before them not as their king, but as a man who had carried regret for 2 decades. I will step down temporarily, not permanently, to prove that my priorities have finally aligned with what they should have been all along. The court erupted in objections and questions, but Jefferson silenced them with a raised hand. "During my abdication, Captain Levi will serve as regent, guided by a council of advisors I will appoint before stepping down." "A regent with no royal training," one noble scoffed. "A regent with 20 years of military discipline, strategic thinking, and first-hand knowledge of both palace operations and the lives of common citizens," Jefferson corrected. "Precisely the balanced perspective Highcrest needs." Unsurprisingly, the announcement sparked immediate resistance from traditional nobles. For weeks, Jefferson navigated a careful political course, leveraging his remaining authority to secure Levi's position, while simultaneously working to legitimize his relationship with Josephine. The people of Highcrest, however, proved more accepting than the nobility. Word of the romantic tale. A king reunited with his lost love after 20 years, a son restored to his rightful parents, spread rapidly through the kingdom. Common folk gathered daily outside the castle, hoping for glimpses of the woman they now called the Scarred Queen and the true-born captain. Josephine's recovery accelerated once she could walk the castle grounds, particularly the small garden where she and Jefferson had once met in secret. Though now overgrown, Jefferson had ordered it preserved throughout his reign, unable to bring himself to destroy that final connection to hope. "You kept it," she said softly, as they stood among flowering bushes that had grown wild and untamed. "I kept everything," he admitted, "though I buried it deep, like the garden behind these walls." She touched his face gently. "We've both been buried, Jefferson. Perhaps it's time we both bloomed again." 3 months after Duke Cornelius's failed coup, Jefferson formally abdicated the throne for a period of 1 year. The ceremony was conducted with all the proper ritual, though the king added unprecedented elements. including having Josephine stand beside him as he removed his crown. That same day, in a more private ceremony, Jefferson and Josephine were married. She wore no veil to hide her scars, and the simple gold band he placed on her finger meant more than any crown. Levi, standing witness to his parents' union, found himself caught between joy at their happiness and the enormous responsibility of his regency. That evening, Josephine found him alone on the castle battlements, staring out over the kingdom he now temporarily ruled. "Having second thoughts?" she asked gently. "A captain follows orders," he replied, though his smile was tense. "Even when those orders are to rule a kingdom, you're more than a captain now," she joined him at the parapet. "And you've been more than a nephew your entire life, though you didn't know it." "I'm not sure who I am anymore," he admitted. Levi the orphan, the Duke's nephew, the captain of the guard. All were lies. "Not lies," Josephine corrected. "Incomplete truths. The loyalty, courage, and judgment you developed are real, regardless of how you came to possess them." In the courtyard below, preparations continued for the next day's public ceremony, where Levi would formally be recognized as Regent and Prince of Highcrest. Jefferson had insisted on the dual titles, one earned through merit, one acknowledging birthright. "What will you do when father returns to the throne?" Levi asked. Josephine smiled, the scar on her cheek softening in the fading light. "Help him rule differently than before. The kingdom needs healing as much as its king did." The following day, as Josephine was formally crowned as Queen of Highcrest, she addressed the assembled court with words that would be remembered for generations. "The scars on my face tell the story of 20 years of pain, but the invisible scars on my heart tell a story of love that not even time could erase. May this kingdom be governed not by pride, but by the compassion that is born when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable." The two halves of the royal medallion, soldered together during the ceremony, became the new symbol of Highcrest, a broken circle made whole again, representing that true nobility lies not in blood, but in the courage to love despite all adversity.